yourself if you can answer one thing. How much is each of you guilty for all the evil in the world? Why do you do the things you do? Why?
As The Sound of Fury was being filmed, Hollywood, spearheaded by the House of Un-American Activities Committee, was already in the final stages of purging itself off of its supposed communism. In light of this, the film's parallels to reality, manhunted and lynched and perverted reformulations of justice, feel glaring. The film was released on December 12, 1950. Not a year later, Cy Enfield, its director, found himself on a one-way boat trip to England after having been named a former Communist Party member. It proved a premature end to yet another promising Hollywood career, of which the onset of the 50s and its concomitant reactionary era proved all too often its perpetrator. Cyril Enfield was born in New York to Jewish immigrants from Poland, a background shared with many of his future fellow blacklistees. Between childhood and adolescence, he oscillated between magic and a bridged year at Yale, the theater, and edifying intellectual conversations with longtime friend and later screenwriter Paul Gierico, who convinced him to try his luck in Hollywood. Biographer Brian Neve describes Enfield as a man tenaciously entrenched in politics, and though Enfield himself rejected the description, a look at his first ventures into film give good reasons to believe it. His first short film was the ambitious Inflation, made at MGM's Propaganda Shorts department in 1942. At the behest of Hitler, the devil himself attempts to disconcert America's war efforts by implanting consumerist desires onto its citizens. While meant to emphasize the importance of thrift, so typical of austerity rhetoric, it contrarily betrayed the manipulability of the populace that buys what they are told to buy, even if they do not need it. A core impetus of capital accumulation, he entirely detached from the supposedly free hand of the market. His debut film, The Argyle Secret, lampoons the detective mystery tension of the Maltese Falcon, in which the so-called Argyle Papers, an expose on American businesses that collaborated with the Nazis, become Enfield's version of the vaunted Falcon. While obviously little more than a MacGuffin, the act of implicating American businessmen at that, in fascist war crimes remains a brave and noteworthy inclusion given its time of release. 1950 saw Enfield release two important films, obviously The Sound of Fury, but also The Underworld Story, a few months earlier. In it, Dan Duryea plays a big city reporter fired for publishing a story that led to the death of a state witness. Quickly finds work for a local newspaper, where his opportunism overshadows objectivity and justice in ways analogous to what Wilder would do with Ace in the Hole a few years later. Fully entrenched in noir iconography, Enfield explores the corruption of the media, small-town racism, upper-class perfidy, and the insidious interplay between the three. At the forefront of his work is a polemical, interrogatory man, precisely the character that was to be eliminated by Hua. Earning good reviews and anticipating a move upwards, Enfield nevertheless stood at the fore of a tide already closing in on him. The Sound of Fury opens on a note of defeat. Howard Tyler returns home to his family after yet another futile job search. Unable to pay even for daily groceries, time is ticking for the last remnants of the Dust Bowl migrators. Howard's family, of course, like many others, moved to California in hopes of a stable future.
Can I help it if a million other guys have the same idea?
At a bowling bar, he meets Jerry, his polar opposite, an homme fatale, oozing with swagger, moving with purpose. He has worked for Howard, and after much, or rather very little deliberation, Howard becomes his getaway driver for gas station and corner store robberies. He returns home, at last useful again, able to buy all the luxury items his wife had hitherto shared with the rest of the shantytown reminiscent neighborhoods. Once profit shares shrink, Jerry hitches a new plan and abducts the son of a wealthy businessman to demand a sizable ransom. Howard objects, but can't refuse. Things naturally end in murder, and Howard's psyche spirals into despair. When the two are arrested for the murder, a local columnist calls for their head in a series of vicious articles, enraging the local populace to take matters into their own hands. In the final act, the film shifts into something unforeseen. The traditional score that had dominated the film up to this point ceases, just as the two now incarcerated criminals become voice and faceless victims. In front of the police station, the masses gather and form imposing, impersonal shapes, eventually storm the station, exploding both in frame and montage when they jump the staircase, at last ripping the two out of their cells like ferocious animals. In his view of a liminal communist, Enfield recognizes the power of the masses, the natural given that people are capable of overthrowing the status quo. But, himself having become disillusioned, he recognizes that they are too rotten to be mobilized for a fitting cause. It is a scene not terribly unlike Fritz Lang's first Hollywood film Fury from 1936, which dealt with the same incident where good normal citizens deform into violent monsters upon the chance at free murder. Paul Jericho once proclaimed it as an example of the progressive radical potential in Hollywood. Unlike Fury, which plays with the concepts of guilt and innocence oscillating, Enfield's protagonists are unambiguously guilty of their crime. This only strengthens in a dialectical move their innocence as the victims of the lynching. Both films make for perfect visualizations of mob mentality. Enfield's in particular aligns seamlessly with the way Adorno wrote about it in Freudian Fury and the pattern of fascist propaganda, written just after the film released, but building on Adorno's work in the 40s. In the text, Adorno pinpoints fascist speech as elicitor of fear and paranoia in a specific group, united by certain individual psychological tendencies that are finalized in the group context. The columnist here is the clear fascist agitator, as Adorno understood him, and the mass is the one eventually dissolving into pure effervescence, freed from rationality and thought. Of course, unlike the classic examples Adorno names, the mob and Sound of Fury do not follow the idealized leader figure, but their drive for lynching Howard and Jerry invoke the historical grounds on which their country is built on. The inherent contradiction in their supposed rationale, i.e. protecting the integrity of the US, a priori spurious given that they are breaking that same integrity to commit the murder, betrays the surplus enjoyment garnered from those tendencies. Screenwriter Abraham Polanski once said about noir,
"All films about crime are about capitalism. Because capitalism is about crime."
This presupposition builds the roof of the social dramas of the 40s and early 50s, of which Sound of Fury is a product. If one understands the primary function of film to be critique, as Lang and Brecht did among others, it is easy to see how noirs became emblems for anti-capitalist rhetoric. With Sound of Fury, Enfield seeked a deeper societal analysis than the novel on which it was based offered, focusing on Howard and his decline into crime for economic forces and the dreams of middle-class stability instilled into him and his family that ultimately lead him to break his morals. The pervasive post-war setting that opens the film, of veterans and their families planted in cheap housing, struggling to support them, is furthered in the visual dialectic between Howard's home and the columnist's sumptuous Spanish-style estate, which he earned by nefarious yet entirely legal means. A further point of comfort, which distinguishes him from Howard, is precisely his distance to all. He's able to watch everything unfold, feel remorseful, even change his stance. As a member of bourgeois circles, he's granted the freedom of guilt, a guilt that will leave him materialistically unaltered. Whereas Howard, who felt a similar guilt perhaps after the murder, pays for his mistake with his life. Enfield visualizes this distance. The columnist never stands too close to the mass, never too close to the violence. Even as they are passing him in the hallway, the two are only conjoined through the mirror reflection in the background. How are these films that Polanski mentioned possible? And secondly, More importantly, how did they stop being made? The answering of both questions inevitably leads us to the conclusion of Enfield's Hollywood career. The war on fascism provided an acquiescence to leftist ideas in films where they were positioned next to reminders of nationalism and austerity. Indeed, many of the anti-Nazi films of the first half of the decade were written by to-be blacklisted screenwriters, including the retroactively controversialized Song of Russia, written by Paul Jericho, later decried as Russian, by extension communist propaganda by Ayn Rand, which opened the doors for HUAC and their investigations in Hollywood.
If you live in a country where human life is nothing, less than nothing, and you know it, you don't know who, when is going to do what to you because he may have friends somewhere.
The end of the war brought forth a change in genre necessary to retain this progressive momentum, however mild it seems retroactively. It was found in film noir, to which social commentary was as essential as the exposure of social contradiction in a good melodrama. And as in a good melodrama, the guise of genre feathered it against initial suspicion. Artists could revitalize the spirits of the 30s social drama to direct social excoriations behind the comfortable formula of the crime thriller. It worked because it was real, not realistic in the superficial sense, seeing as its working class realism was successively psychologized but grounded. The disillusioned, disoriented veteran, the neglected loser were actual types, actual people, emblematic of their time, and they weren't few. The need for money accruement, material success, outweighed the people capable of it, yet capitalist ideology endemic to the American dream obscures that fact and rationalizes corruption and betrayal. Noir got to the bottom of it, whether at MGM or RKO. Coinciding with the shift to noir was America's shift to avert anti-communism as it steamed towards the Cold War in the late 40s. During this brief interstice, however, directors made some of the most damning films about the system. Soon, they would be considered subversive. As the fears of the nation changed, perforce did its cinema, mended in great parts by the trials and blacklistings that occurred from 1947 onwards, courtesy of HUAC, and emblematized in the infamous Hollywood 10, originally known as the Unfriendly 19, and their show trials. In line with Adorno's observation qua fascist agitator speech, the enforcers of the blacklist relied on crude demonizations of communism as a force so evil and dangerous that battling it justified bullying, guilt by association, and the suppression of any kind of free speech. As later trials showed, those are not enough to denounce communism simply. One had rather to undergo a ritualistic act, humiliation, implicating others to absolve oneself, thereby bowing to the powerful, capricious state. The air soon soured to a point, suspecting even those merely expressing doubt over the constitutionality of HUAC's operation, as highlighted in the implosion of the Committee for the First Amendment. A group of liberals criticized the avowed breaches of free speech. As soon as producers, spearheaded by Eric Johnson, then president of the Motion Picture Association of America, the association that represented the 5 major studios, greenlit the blacklisting and prosecution amidst pressures from the public, and the 10 lost their grounding fully, those same stars of the committee had now to defend themselves, forcing even the likes of Humphrey Bogart, by this point one of Hollywood's most bankable faces, to write articles freeing themselves of accusations, pleading innocence, in the process further fueling anti-communist rhetoric. In his article, Bogart claimed to have known nothing about communism, to have been deceived. It is crucial that Bogart did not know what communism meant truly, for no one in HUAC or Hollywood did either. It was enough to paint him as the outsider, the threat, and attach to it all undesirable traits. RKO fired Adrian Scott and Edward Dmytryk quickly after the announcements, citing a disreputable conduct as reason. While not implicated yet, Enfield very well knew that his time was coming. Most party members, even mere friends of them, found their name eventually uttered, and so too Enfield, who by the late 40s grew disillusioned with the ideology and left the party, sensed the inevitable. In that regard, Sound of Fury feels like a large statement of someone cognizant of their forthcoming demise. Sound of Fury pushes the political components of the late 40s noir into its utmost extreme and violent. It is among the final wave of social dramas consisting in the likes of He Ran All the Way, The Prowler, Night in the City, all by directors to be blacklisted within the following months, all which end in the only way they possibly could, but it is Sound of Fury that goes an additional step, directly condemning the people and the situation they are enshrouded in. For this, he had to leave.